Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the University of Virginia and to the Miller Center. We've got an exciting program this morning. I'm George Forsman. I'm a senior advisor on national security at the National Security Data and Policy Institute. I am not Phil Potter. Phil has a sick child today, and so he asked me to stand in. And this is one of those things that I'm really excited to do. We've got a great program this morning. We've got with us two very qualified individuals, and we're going to have the opportunity to talk about a new book that's out. The book is The Double Black Box: National Security, Artificial Intelligence, and the Struggle for Democratic Accountability. And it's penned by our Vice Dean of the Law School, Ashley Deeks. And Ashley is with us this morning. Ashley is both an accomplished academic and certainly a phenomenal practitioner, having spent time in Washington. Ashley is joined this morning by Brian Lessenberry. Brian is a former senior executive service career civil servant in the U.S. government, recently left the Department of State. He and his family have relocated to the Charlottesville area. And we're happy to have both of them this morning because artificial intelligence is at the forefront of everything that we're talking about today, from an economic standpoint, but especially from a national security standpoint. And Phil and I have the pleasure of spending a lot of time with senior leaders, and I think our senior leaders across the U.S. government are wrestling with how is artificial intelligence going to change the landscape going forward. What we're going to do this morning is we're going to spend a little bit of time and talk a little about Ashley, have Ashley talk a little about the book, why she wrote it. But before we do that, I want both Ashley, if you wouldn't mind, and Brian as well, maybe to give you a minute or two on their background, because I think context is important in these discussions. Where you sit is how you see the problem, and both of these individuals have sat in very important roles across the U.S. government, and I think that's going to be an important context setter. So Ashley, maybe first to you, a minute or two, how'd you get here?
Good question. I ask myself that all the time. And I'll just say thanks very much to George for stepping in at the last minute on this. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the Miller Center's willingness to host this. So I have spent two different times in government. The first was more extensive. I spent 10 years at the State Department in the Office of the Legal Advisor, and that's a place where you can rotate among different offices. Most of my time was spent either in law enforcement and intelligence or in an office that's called Political Military Affairs, the primary client of which is the Political Military Bureau at the State Department. So this was a period of time post 9/11. There were lots of legal and legal policy issues around our conflict with al-Qaeda, uses of force, detention, and so on. So that was where I kind of got my interest in and some experience and exposure to national security. And in that context, I worked a lot with other agencies, including the Defense Department, the intelligence community, and the Justice Department, among others. I then was lucky enough to have an opportunity to go back in more recently for about a year and a half to the National Security Council, where I served as the Deputy Legal Advisor. And part of what that job entailed was to help coordinate legal positions among different agencies. So again, getting exposure to a range of legal views across the administration, seeing how the legal negotiations fit into larger policy negotiations. And also we served as kind of the in-house general counsel for the White House and served in the White House counsel's office. So that's the perspective, having seen it both from a single agency perspective and then also from an interagency perspective that was doing national security work.
Thanks, Ashley. And one of the things we always say about the U.S. government is it's the most functional, dysfunctional family. And just because you're part of the U.S. government doesn't necessarily mean you agree with your counterparts across the U.S. government. And I think we're going to pull on that thread a little. Brian, tell us a little about your background, what got you here, and why you chose Charlottesville.
Sure. Thank you, George, and thank you as well to the Miller Center and NSDPI for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. I'm excited to be a part of this community and to contribute to it as we go forward. I'm coming from the perspective of a former intelligence analyst. I have nearly 30 years of experience in the U.S. intelligence community in a variety of different roles. And I began my career really focused on foreign nuclear weapons and materials programs, trying to take all the available information that was coming in from all the different sources and discern what different nations may or may not be doing in that space. And it was really, at that point in my career, really focused on the analytic craft and trying to learn from those who had come before me the lessons of the past. Where had we gone wrong, and how could we prevent making similar mistakes going forward in providing the best possible information and decision advantage for the policymakers and decision makers that we support, and ultimately for the nation. As time went on and I became more senior, my focus shifted somewhat to emphasize how do we present, how does the U.S. intelligence community, how does any individual analyst present their analytic findings to a policymaker or decision maker in a way that they can use it most effectively. And really, again, coming back to that concept of decision advantage and superior outcomes. We weren't searching for knowledge for the sake of knowledge or information for the sake of information, but rather to provide actionable information to the most senior decision makers. And then finally, most recently, my focus has been on has come back to that question of analytic tradecraft. Those lessons learned and best practices, often learned the hard way through failures and mistakes of the past. How do we apply those professional ethics and that analytic tradecraft to emerging technologies like artificial intelligence? How do we take advantage of all that these technologies have to offer, but at the same time stay true to our values and our legal, ethical, and moral requirements in that regard? Like Ashley, I've had the opportunity to do this both from the perspective of a single agency as well as the larger intelligence and national security community. And so it's exciting to be part of this conversation today.
All right, thanks, Brian. And, I was talking with Ashley and Brian before we came into the room, and I told Ashley I was old enough to remember leaving my office one Friday afternoon in a public safety role that I was in before I went to the U.S. government, and I had an IBM Selectric typewriter on my desk. And I came in on Monday morning, and there was a computer connected to this thing called the internet. And a short decade later, I found myself in a role where we were wrestling with security, privacy, a series of policy issues around the evolution of technology, because we were so focused on deploying technology, we weren't thinking about it. So, Ashley, with that in mind, you make an argument in the book. There's two black boxes. One is the national security, the other is artificial intelligence. Why this book? Why now? And what's your thesis?
So the reason that I ultimately decided to write this book, it was an effort to bring together two strands of writing that I had been doing over at the law school. And one strand was focused on government secrecy. I taught a seminar on government secrecy. It was a phenomenon that I had experienced, obviously, from within the government. And government secrecy raises hard questions in a democracy. So I was thinking about not only the ways in which our traditional checks on the executive can operate, so actors like Congress and the courts, but also ways that non-traditional checks might play a role. So thinking about actors like our foreign allies, who can sometimes see behind the veil of secrecy and have their own laws and their own views about how we should do things. I was thinking about states and localities, U.S. states and localities, and they too sometimes cooperate with the federal government in a kind of quasi-national security role. And so I had this line of scholarship thinking about kind of non-traditional checks in government secrecy. I also was interested in the ways in which artificial intelligence was going to start to play a role in national security operations, so particularly in the Defense Department and in intelligence operations. And there, one thing I was interested in thinking more about was, where is AI going to appear beyond what are called lethal autonomous weapon systems? This sort of killer robot model. There were lots of people writing about that. That was the sort of most advanced, most extreme use of AI. But it occurred to me that our agencies were going to be using AI for a lot of things short of that. So I was fortunate enough that Oxford approached me and said, hey, we see you've been doing some writing on AI and national security. would you be interested in writing up a book proposal on this? And I thought, actually, this might be a way to force myself to kind of bring those two strands of writing together and see what happened. So that's what happened.
Well, and I'm glad you did, because I think for a lot of folks, I mean, AI is at the forefront of everything we're talking about day in and day out. And thinking about it in the context of national security, we don't want to repeat the same problem of, 10 years from now saying, we should have thought about this. And so you're helping us think about it. Brian, you've had the opportunity to read Ashley's book, and you're just leaving this role in Washington. Talk to us a little about, as a practitioner, what you feel like, how is Ashley's book going to stimulate the conversation?
Sure. I think Ashley is asking exactly the right questions at exactly the right time. And it's really important that we take a look at this, not just now, but on a continuing basis going forward. So I want to kind of start from that perspective. As I think about this through the lens of a practitioner, I'm reminded that often when we talk about artificial intelligence, we approach it as something that is entirely new and novel. Yet many of the questions that Ashley addresses in her book are long-time, enduring questions that the intelligence and national security communities have dealt with for, in some cases, many, many decades. We're not starting from scratch. There's a very large and extensive body of law, policy, and regulation governing just about everything in the national security space. To use a specific example, as a former intelligence analyst, one of the areas where there's an extensive set of guidelines and regulations and requirements, both from a legal and a policy perspective, bears upon the issue of accuracy, objectivity, the freedom from bias of any kind, the integrity of the analytic process, and the explainability and the transparency of the data which is used to arrive at intelligence conclusions. Many of these are born from the lessons learned from 9/11 and the Iraq WMD experience, and now they are baked in as building block principles for our intelligence community and national security practitioners. And these same focus on accuracy, objectivity, and integrity are very much relevant and very applicable to the use of artificial intelligence today. That being said, I got to experience firsthand and witness with my own eyes that the executive and legislative branches being very forward-leaning, applying additional guardrails, not being satisfied with the laws, regulations, and policies that are already in place, but developing new and increasingly more detailed requirements that specifically speak to data provenance, data security, and the safe, responsible, and ethical use of artificial intelligence. So the regulatory and the compliance environment today, as it exists in the national security community, very different from what it was even just a few short months ago, as we see new laws, new policies, new requirements come out onto the books and start to be practiced. In terms of gaps, and Ashley speaks to this in the book, if I were to point to any one thing, is really the question of how do we operationalize this? As we get increasingly more detailed and increasingly more specific reporting requirements and documentary requirements, how do we implement these in a way that ensures that we're true to the intent of the legislative and the executive branches, but we don't unduly impede the mission of our operators, whether they be analysts or those out in the field?
Brian, thanks for that. And Ashley, I want to come to you, and maybe you want to react a little to what Brian said, but he used the word transparency. And, kind of a core tenet of your book is AI is a black box. National security is a black box. We live in a democracy where transparency is essential to the ability of Congress to provide oversight, the executive to be able to make decisions, the judicial to interpret whether those decisions are within the confines of law. Help us understand this black box concept that you've put out here.
Sure, thanks. And I realized I didn't engage you on your question about what is the thesis.
That's
so
all right.
let me do that.
But in Washington, we always answer the question we want to answer, not the one we were asked.
That's right. I'm a skilled practitioner on that. So let me just explain briefly what I see as the two black boxes, and then the double black box, because I think that will help go to your transparency point. So as I describe in the book, one of the black boxes that we have perennially wrestled with, and I think Brian's making this point, is that our government has to make lots of decisions in secret. Why? Well, it's using sensitive technologies, it is drawing on sensitive intelligence that we may have collected, and we're developing sensitive operational plans. As a result, for those to be effective, we have to keep this secret from our adversaries or other states that were interested in affecting their behavior. But that, of course, means we also have to keep it secret from the US public. Right? We can't share with the US public and keep it secret from our adversaries. And so I think it is generally understood that national security agencies tend to operate in this black box. And let me just say why I think that's often thought of as a problem. What we worry about when we're worried about government secrecy, I think, is that we're worried that our government is not acting consistent with what some people call our public law values. And I tease out 4 in the book, but there are more that I don't necessarily try to apply. But things like legality, we want our government to be acting lawfully. Effectiveness or efficiency, we don't want them to be spending vast amounts of money on stupid programs. We want to have there be some accountability. Who's making the decisions? Who made that decision that might be problematic? And I think we also want our officials to be in a position to have to justify the choices that they've made to some actor outside their narrow bucket, right? And often that is someone like Congress. It might be someone like the court. So the concern about the national security black box is linked to this concern about public law values. Some people group transparency into that bucket. That's often thought of as a public law value. But the reason that I don't really dwell on that is national security and transparency are in real tension. I'm not going to advocate, and I don't try to advocate in the book, that we should just open up all of our secrets so that that's transparent to the public, because that would defeat much of what we're doing. So I don't rest that heavily on the transparency point per se. The AI black box may be easier to explain. We have these very sophisticated predictive algorithms. We have these large language models. And they are able to make these often quite accurate predictions or write very accurate documents, or documents that look accurate and maybe aren't. But we don't know how they're doing that. And the users, people like us using ChatGPT, we don't really know how these systems, most of us don't know how these systems are actually producing what they're producing. Senior officials who are deciding to authorize the use of these systems inside the government, they don't really know how they're operating. And often the people who are developing the systems, they know what data they're feeding in, they know what values and weights they're according to these systems, but they don't really know exactly what's happening inside the system for it to shoot out the answer that it gives. So that is the AI black box, and the point in the book is that we are now at a stage where we have the AI black box being embedded inside the national security black box, and that makes our assessment of whether the government's complying with public law values even more complicated.
Yeah, and Ashley, this is difficult because at the National Security Data and Policy Institute, we were established to really look at this intersect of technology, AI, public policy, and particularly in the national security context, transparency holistically, probably not so good. But if our civilian decision makers inside the national security apparatus are going to make decisions, for instance, on the use of lethal force, they're going to want to understand how did the AI provide information to give them a level of assurance that it's both legal, ethical, and legitimate in the context of core values. Brian, any reaction, as you think about what Ashley has said here?
Yes. One of the things that comes to mind here is, as I mentioned, that we're experiencing a very high degree of dynamism in the regulatory environment, and there are new requirements and new regulations in place today that weren't there just a few short months ago. One of the areas where this is most profound is that we are seeing a steady progression beyond the initial principles and the initial requirements that were issued in the form of laws, executive orders, and other regulations in the early 2020s, And now we're increasingly seeing both the legislature and the executive branch issue very specific implementing guidance and very specific and detailed requirements for those who are out there and having to use these systems on a day in and day out. And so we've gone from the general commitment to ethical, responsible, safe, and secure AI to now very specific documented requirements that our national security agencies and departments must comply with. These relate to documentation of exactly what data is used to train AI models. What is the quality of that data? Where did it come from? How much confidence do we have in it? And what are its shortcomings? What are its gaps? Along the same lines, what data are you feeding into an AI model once it is developed? And many of the same questions about data provenance and data quality and data security. And as Ashley mentions in the book and in our comments today, we're now starting to see very specific and detailed requirements for documenting the models themselves. What are the weights that are being applied to it as it processes the data that goes into it? And even before that, what is the actual purpose, the role, the mission of the model that is being used? And then how do we evaluate the quality, just as we evaluate the quality of the information that goes into it, how do we evaluate the quality that comes out? So in today's operating environment, there are a lot more specific and detailed requirements that our operators and our practitioners are contending with. Now that's good, as Ashley points out in her book, but as I noted earlier, how do we operationalize that? It's one thing to say you must document all this data and you must assess the value of it in the quantity. How do you do that in a time-sensitive, high-stakes environment? What does that look like, and where do you go? I know there's increasing scholarship and research in this field that's increasingly focusing on the issue of testing and evaluation. There are requirements on the books today that any new AI system used in the national security space must be tested and evaluated before it's authorized for use in real world missions. More importantly, however, I would point to new requirements that have come out in recent months focused on the continuous and ongoing testing of those systems in real-world conditions, where the system would encounter reasonable real-life scenarios. How do you differentiate between a school bus and a missile system, for example, in a high-stakes, high-profile environment? So I think the greater emphasis on this testing and evaluation aspect, and so we can get greater insight and confidence in the performance of these systems going forward, is really going to be key.
Yeah, please.
So two things. I think things Brian has said remind me that I should sort of come in behind that and say, it is the case when you look at what our Defense Department or Department of War and the intelligence community have done from the beginning. We have been, I think, better at least articulating at a pretty high level the values that we want those systems to comply with. So you've used, responsibility, transparency, sort of minimizing bias, a range of values that many actors agree on. I think other states would agree on. I think many companies have policies that are sort of similar. So, and the IC did something interesting, which is it came out with kind of a list of questions that potential adopters, potential users should be asking as they're developing these systems. And I thought that was a kind of interesting format. So I do, but I agree. It sounds like what you're saying is those agencies have now come down a level of specificity to articulate even more fine-grained sort of standards and procedures to comply with. But there is still another, at least one, if not two more complicated steps in terms of actually operationalizing that. And then, so I guess one question for you is, if people here were interested in looking at this kind of one level down document, can they find that on the Defense Department website or the intelligence community website? Are these publicly available?
I'm so glad you asked. And the answer is enthusiastically yes.
Yeah.
All of these documents and everything that I've referred to today is publicly available. It's been published, and it is available on both the DNI and other cabinet-level department websites. And that's not a choice. That's a legal requirement, actually, as we see both the executive and the legislative attempt to bring additional transparency to this.
Ashley, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. I want to talk a little about the courts because they've got an important role to play as we talk about this regulatory and legal environment. But I want to remind everybody in the room, as well as those folks who've joined us online, that we're going to save some time at the end. We're going to save about 15 minutes for questions, and we've passed out small 3x5 note cards that keeps your questions short, pithy, to the point. We passed out note cards to the folks here in the room. If you have a question, either for Brian or Ashley or both of them, we'll have the opportunity to do that in the final 15 minutes. And for those folks that are online, you should be able to look there on your screen, and you'll find the place where you can put the question in, because this is an important issue. It's an issue that I think a lot of people are interested in, and we want to make sure that we've got the opportunity to hear from the group. So Ashley, we talk about this in the context of these two black boxes. We talk about it in the context of some degree of at least transparency internal to the national security environment. Brian talks about the fact that we're going through this process where we're getting one level down, but the courts have an important role, and we find ourselves in this period of time where laws often lag capabilities, and our ability to adjudicate what is appropriate or not appropriate lags those capabilities as well. So, maybe talk a little about the environment that we find ourselves in, not right or wrong, good or bad. We're in a period of turmoil inside the U.S. government, but the courts, the legislative branch, the executive branch, give us a little bit of context of when we think about national security, when we think about AI, when we think about the rapid pace of change. Help us understand that environment.
Sure. So these are the two actors that we tend to think of as the primary checks on the executive. You note that the laws lag. I think that's absolutely true. I think it's long been true, but it is, I think, feels particularly true in this situation we're in, where the tech is evolving so quickly. I think Congress has had some challenges being sufficiently educated on exactly how AI works. The better that Congress understands these systems, the more informed Congress will be in both providing oversight by asking questions of the executive branch through the respective committees, for example, and in actually legislating provisions related to AI. Brian has referred to a couple, but in general, I think Congress has not robustly stepped in. That's true in general for tech, right? We do not have privacy a lot of privacy laws and so on. So I think Congress has some educational challenges here. There are some political challenges as well. In terms of the courts, I think the courts have a very difficult time here. Our courts do not often have a really robust role in the national security space. It's for a couple of reasons. First of all, courts can't reach out and find cases themselves. They have to wait until somebody tries to bring a case. It is sometimes hard to find plaintiffs who actually have standing to bring a particular case to challenge a particular national security policy. They sometimes they don't really, these are hard questions, and they have high political salience, and they might want to avoid having to decide them, so they can use something like what we call the political question doctrine to say this is really a question for the political branches to work out. And when they do decide these cases, they give a lot of deference to the executive branch because they feel like the executive is more competent in understanding the technology and whether it's appropriate to use a particular technology to engage in a particular activity against a threat, right? The courts don't feel like they are particularly well suited to assess threat. So I think Congress is, in general, has a hard time in the national security space. I think it will have a hard time adjudicating AI cases, national security AI cases that come before it. I will say maybe two things. One is there may be some cases where the government is a defendant, but not in the national security space, where the government comes forward and says, well, we did this particular social security program, and we used AI to sort of take a first cut at claims. We don't really understand the the model that we use particularly well, but this is what we did, the courts are not going to love that, right? The courts will push back. They will potentially demand more explainable AI, which will in turn, I think, drive what the tools that the executive is using in those spaces. And that can have ramifications over into the national security side as well. We may also start to see civil cases about large language models where people are challenging their use, they're challenging their accuracy. And what the courts say in those cases may also inform how the executive is thinking about the tools that are appropriate to use kind of behind the veil of secrecy.
Yeah, and Brian, I maybe want to give you an opportunity to react to that as well, but I remind the folks here in the room, if you do have a question written down, I see that a couple have been passed in, but just hold your card up not too high, don't block the cameras, because we've got two very photogenic folks and me here, but please hold those up so we can make sure that we get these questions in. Brian, any thoughts to what Ashley had to say?
I think the challenges he raises are real ones, first and foremost. Speaking on the issue of congressional oversight, as somebody, as a former practitioner, I would share the perspective that our colleagues in the legislative branch, both in the oversight committees, whether that be intelligence, armed services, or the appropriators, and their staffs, they take their oversight role incredibly seriously, and they take their obligations to the Constitution and to the American people incredibly seriously, and that ultimately is a good thing. Sometimes when we talk about congressional oversight, it sounds as if it's an arm's length relationship. And in my experience, I found it to be much more organic. This wasn't we'll go down to the Hill once a quarter or once a year, but rather there was an ongoing and continuing organic conversation that was taking place almost on a day-by-day, if not a week-by-week basis. And that conversation made us all better. Did you want to get that question? Did you want to have to write that report? Probably not, but it made us better. And so the oversight committees, in particular on the intelligence and armed services side, are really leaning forward into this space. One particular model that I would highlight as an example of this is the FY23 National Defense Authorization Act, many of which provisions remain in place today. That act contains a section which requires all intelligence agencies as independent organizations and the DNI in its role as the coordinator and oversight body for the intelligence community to provide annual reports to the Congress on AI use cases. How exactly are you using AI in the national security space? And do it at a classified level where you can provide quite a bit of detail in that. And not only how are you using AI in that space, but how are you applying the principles that Ashley referred to in that document with the questions about ethical, responsible, safe, and secure AI? What does this look like for your particular agency, and what does this look like for the community as a whole? I think what's really interesting, and I can say that now from my current perspective, what's really interesting is that the Congress also added a second provision to that requirement. And it was that the inspector generals at every IC agency were to then evaluate the reports that the agencies prepared in response to this requirement for accuracy and completion and report back to the Congress independently. So here you have the executive, the legislative, and then the inspector generals providing a oversight in three unique and independent ways to try to get at this issue of are you doing what you say you are doing?
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. I want to spend a few minutes before we get to the question and answer session. We often spend time wringing our hands about the problems that we face as a country, but the question I think I'd pose, especially to you, Ashley, because you've spent the time focused on the problem, and you've got to, Einstein said if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes studying the problem, I'd save the world in 5 minutes. And you've spent the 55 minutes studying the problem. Now, if we think about it, if you happen to be in charge, and Brian, I'm going to ask you the same question. You're back in Washington, you're in charge, you've got full authority to do all of the things. What's next when we think about this AI issue, when we think about the national security issue, we think about these two black boxes, because you make a valid argument. For valid reasons, they cannot be completely transparent to the American people. But at the same time, at the core of our democracy is this ability to ensure that we have checks and balances. So in the what's next category, where would you go?
So I do talk in the book. One chapter is about things that our traditional checks could do. So there I'm thinking about mostly Congress, the courts, maybe some whistleblowers. And then the non-traditional checks is a separate chapter. So on the traditional checks, one thing I think about is, and Brian, you suggested this right at the beginning. You said, this is not the first time we've ever worried about, the executive branch doing potentially high-profile, potentially risky things in secret. So there are some long-standing kind of framework statutes that we have had on the books since the 70s, including a statute that regulates the president's use of covert action, and one that regulates the use of foreign intelligence surveillance. And those have endured, and they're written at a pretty high level of generality, which means that they're kind of technology agnostic. FISA a little bit less so. But so I contemplate that Congress could actually create a kind of parallel oversight statute that would require the president to basically make findings where he is authorizing the use of very high-risk AI, national security AI. And you'd have to define what that meant, but it might mean AI systems that could actually be used to take a life or to engage in detention, criminal process, those kinds of things, and use those existing statutory frameworks as a potential model that would make sure that these systems are being approved at the highest levels. It would ensure congressional notice of their use, report on what happened after their use, and so on. There are other things as well that I think Congress could do. They created what was called the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. You could imagine a kind of, that's called the PCLOB, a kind of AI-focused PCLOB that is within the executive branch, but a little bit removed from any one agency, that would examine the types of AI systems that the different agencies are using and potentially make recommendations. You could imagine something like, we have a joint taxation committee in Congress that is made up of members from both the House and Senate, because tax is a particularly important and persistent topic and complicated, and so maybe you could have a joint committee on AI where you have members from both houses thinking through these issues more holistically for Congress. The executive branch, there's some things I think it could do to kind of maintain an atmosphere where agencies are not afraid to challenge other agencies about some of the choices that they're making. That requires, of course, people like lawyers, people like government lawyers, to make sure that they have a fluency in what AI is, how it works, what some of the risks are, what concerns would be if you are using a tool developed for one project in another project. So I think there is an onus on government lawyers to think about that, especially if you're in an agency that doesn't use AI or isn't going to use AI all the time. So, for example, I would say the State Department and Justice Department lawyers have a particularly important role alongside their Defense Department and intelligence community lawyer partners as well. So I'll pause with that and see what Brian.
Brian?
I agree with everything Ashley has sketched out here. I might come at the question from a slightly different perspective, however. There are three things that I might suggest that we look at. Number one, and Ashley referred to this just a moment ago, is how do we craft these laws, these policies, these regulations? How do we craft them in a way that they are enduring and evergreen, that they're not obsolete the moment a new technology appears on the scene? There's some great examples of how the Congress has done this in the past, and I think if we can take our cues from that, we will be well served. The second key thing that I would look to in the future, and that I referred to earlier, is how do we operationalize these requirements? As I indicated earlier, it's one thing to say agencies and their officers must document where their data came from. They must document what the output of a model was, and so on and so forth. But how do you do that in a very high stakes, very high risk, high profile situation where lives are on the line and time is of the essence? We have found ways to do this as a nation with other technologies. We've found ways to do this in the past. And I'm confident we can do that going forward. But it's going to take some thought. What are those fail-safe mechanisms and guardrails that allow the human in the loop to raise their hand and say, hey, I think we've got a problem here. And the third piece, and building upon that I think, from my perspective, is perhaps might be the most critical, is how do we build a culture of accountability, transparency, and responsibility? I think it's very important and it's necessary, as Ashley has done a fantastic job of laying out, that we do have these top-down laws, these top-down regulations and requirements to set expectations for our national security agencies and communities. But I would make the case that top-down regulation by itself is not sufficient. Much of what we have today in the form of law and policy is a reaction to failures of the past, Pearl Harbor, Vietnam, 9/11, and so on and so forth, when individuals in the legislative, in the executive, and in the national security agencies said, never again, not on my watch. We have an opportunity here to get out ahead of the problem in some ways and think about what can we do now to prevent something catastrophic in the future. And I think our best chance for doing that is baking that culture of accountability, responsibility, and transparency in from the beginning, from the bottom up, so it's an organic part of every operator and practitioners in this space mindset as they approach these hard decisions.
Yeah,
and
please.
is that done through training? Is that done through leadership within a particular office? If you were in charge of the IC right now, what would you do to operationalize that?
It's all of the above. Absolutely, there's a role as you onboard new officers into the community. How do you train them? How do you explain to them? How do you tell them the history of the lessons past? Sometimes these regulations, and I'm old enough now to have experienced this firsthand, they kind of dusty, musty, bureaucratic language. And like, no. We have this requirement because of this catastrophic failure in the past, where lives and treasure were lost because we may or may not have cut corners in some way. And that's a lesson that sticks with folks. So yes, from a training and from a continuing education process, that's absolutely part of it. But I think it's hard to overstate the role of the mentor and the role of the on-the-job training that it's one thing to hear from a teacher or an instructor at the head of a classroom, and that's critically important, make no mistake about it. But to hear from those who have lived through that experience and who have been in those situations, had to apply those conditions, I think that more often than not sticks in some ways that the more formal training doesn't.
Thanks, Brian. I'd like to go to the questions now, and interestingly enough, Ashley, they fall into kind of four buckets, as Phil and I are affectionate of saying, and we'll work our way through that. And what I would say to the folks who've taken the time to put questions forward, and I want to tell one of our young, talented students from the University of Virginia, I'm saving your question for last because it is why we are here at the University of Virginia. And why it's all about the students. But as we get into this, a lot of what is going on in AI right now is in the private sector. And you've got the private sector, both in a national security context, but across the broader whole of government, involved in a wide range of things that, a year ago might not have been the case, and certainly to the degree. And so there are a series of privacy concerns, there are a series of transparency and equity concerns in terms of making sure that everybody across the private sector has the same ability to influence policy. But, Ashley, as you did your research for the book, and certainly Brian, as you've spent time in government, do we have the checks and balances to ensure that the role of the private sector, the role of government, and the division between those roles to ensure that first and foremost, the privacy of the American people is being protected, but that no one entity has too much influence in how we think about policy and AI, particularly in the national security context? Ashley?
Wow, so that is a really big question.
I told you these would be hard.
Yeah, that is a hard one. Let me say a couple of things about the private sector that I think are at least partially responsive to that. So the first is that at some points in time, I think the private sector has actually served as a check on the executive. one example that I will offer is we have some very big cyber companies, think Microsoft, where they have immense visibility onto what is happening to our systems, systems that are using Microsoft software or so on. Maybe even better visibility than the government does. And so there is a relationship between the US government officials who care about cyber issues and Microsoft. And Microsoft might come in and say, we're seeing this particular threat vector, it looks like it's coming from X country. The US government might say, okay, interesting, we've seen something sort of similar, we think it might be coming from Y, and they have a kind of exchange behind the veil of secrecy about each other's, I'll just call it intelligence. And so in that setting, companies are serving as a potential kind of check on the government. And another place you see it, there's this pretty famous example where the government had hired Google to produce a product that was part of what was called Project Maven, where the system was reviewing hours and hours, thousands of hours of video footage and able to identify particular segments of footage that seemed like there was something interesting happening. It wasn't identifying targets per se, but it was, recognizing that a particular military system had moved from place A to place B. And there were employees inside Google that were worried about Google being part of this project. And they ultimately persuaded the leadership of Google, at least for the time being, to not bid on a renewal of the contract because they were concerned about that. So you could think of that as a kind of check. That I think Google has since gone back and bid on that again. I think there are companies, I think differently about defense contractors whose whole reason to be is to provide stuff to the US government versus what we might think of as common use companies, so Google, Microsoft, and so on, where they're making products both that go to the government and that go to us. And if there is, let's say there's a company that's producing a large language model that we're all using, and we see that it's doing something really weird. You'll see articles in CNN and Newsweek and the Wall Street Journal saying, this system has kind of gone off the rails. That's relevant if the US government has purchased that same system and is using it inside the national security space. So we as consumers in this common use company space, I think, can have some effect on how those companies are producing AI systems, which could have a kind of overflow effect into the government. But there's another side to this too, which is that a lot of these companies are downsizing or reducing their ethics teams and are just having a mentality of kind of full steam ahead. If we can do it, we should do it. And you would think having fewer ethics people on staff is maybe not the right approach there. Finally, I'll say, I think there may be, in some cases, kind of contractual solutions here too. So if we are worried about the US government using a commercial system and not really being sure of the data provenance, for example, or so on, the government can insist in contract that it get access to the model weights and the data and so on. So there can be some work there. So I think that's only partially responsible, but I'll stop. Responsive, but I'll halt.
All right, Brian, a couple of minutes, and I want to save enough time for a couple more questions. So any additional thoughts?
I think Ashley hit really at the core of this. When you're talking about AI that has been developed for the national security communities or for the intelligence community, the laws, the policies, regulations are very specific. There's virtually no difference in how those systems are to be treated as opposed to something that may have been developed in-house, internally within the government. The same privacy and civil liberties constraints are very much at play here. It gets messy. Where it gets messy is when you're talking about AI systems that were not developed for national security purposes and then are brought into that environment. And it could be something as simple as the grammar checker on your word processing system. We tend to think about AI and national security. We go to the dark corner of the room, but there's a lot of administrative tools that were not developed for national security purposes that may very well have been trained, and almost certainly have been trained on U.S. persons data. How do you deal with that when it comes into that? The final quick point is there's a tension here. There's a very robust set of regulations and guidelines on how you handle U.S. persons data and minimize the use of that within the national security community. And so you have that on the one hand. But on the other hand, we're starting to see new requirements that are related to AI about transparency and data traceability and making sure that anybody who is using this data is able to see the data that the system was trained on. And so how do you find that balance between being transparent and sharing data at the same time meeting the privacy consideration?
Yeah, Ashley, you wrote in the book about, you had a little piece in there about the declining trust in government and, the impact. And I want to go to one of the questions, well, there were actually 4 questions around the whole use of AI in our counter-narcotics effort. We've seen a change in U.S. policy, not good, bad, right or wrong. It's a change in U.S. policy in terms of how they're dealing with some of the counter-narcotics in the Pacific as well as the Caribbean. If you were back sitting in your role in the White House, both in the counsel's office and the National Security Council, what are the 3 or 4 things that would be foremost in your mind if we think about can AI play a role in our counter-narcotics strategy for the U.S.?
So I guess I might break that into 2 parts. So
Okay.
The first part is a question about the counter-narcotic strategy apart from AI, right? And there are lots of good writings on this online. Lots of smart lawyers have both who are focused on international law and domestic law have raised questions about the legality of striking these boats in a counter-narcotic sense. I assume that's part of what motivating the question. So I think there are real questions there apart from the use of AI. I haven't given a lot of thought to the particular, whether AI is being used in this setting or not. We don't know that much about the identity of the individuals who have been targeted, why they've been targeted, and so on. So I can't really speak to the AI piece of it. Okay.
Brian, having been at the State Department and thinking about the evolution of technology and how the U.S. uses it, if you were advising, what would you be advising today if they're thinking about using AI and deploying AI in the context of the counter-narcotics strategy?
I can't speak directly to the counter-narcotics situation and would defer to others in that phase. Speaking more generally, I think there are basic fundamental questions that I think we're all familiar with to some degree. What is our mission? What is the objective that we are trying to achieve in any particular scenario or situation? And then what are the tools available to us to accomplish that mission? Sometimes in the literature, AI, it takes on the sense of it's an end in of itself, as opposed to a tool or a means to the end. And so I would take that step back, as we've talked about several times in this conversation, of what are our bedrock principles and how would we handle this situation if we didn't have AI? And then when you introduce an AI, is there any reason to handle it any different?
Good. So Ashley, we've got about 4 minutes left, and Brian, I'll give you a chance on this question, but it was specifically addressed to you. And so whomever this student is gets Best Question of the Day award, but also Best Pencilship, because they didn't use a pen and they wrote it. And I'm going to read it verbatim with a slight modification. As a PhD candidate in data science interested in the intersection of AI and national security, what are some things you hope my generation of data science practitioners consider while working in developing AI tools, and I'll add the word policy to that, used on a daily basis in the U.S., especially if they read your book?
Well, I'll first just say about the penmanship, that's impressive because I think many of my students cannot write with a pen anymore. It's all laptops all the time. So, so kudos to you on being able to actually handwrite. One thing that I've been interested in, and I still want to learn more about, is the fact that when you are creating these systems, you are making choices all along the way in terms of what you are valuing, what you are optimizing for. And I think it can be, I think it's really important to surface that point. And if you are the computer scientist in the room and there is a policymaker in the room and a lawyer in the room, everybody should understand that. Everybody should understand that there are choices being made as you are developing these systems. And you want to make sure that you have the correct inputs when you are making those choices so that the outputs are going to be responsive to what the policymakers and the computer scientists and the lawyers all intend, that it doesn't just get sort of incidentally decided along the way. But I think it's, I'm heartened by, I think it's important that our government has taken this, this kind of further deep dive to really tease out what these high-level values mean. And I think being able to think through how to really implement them in ways that are understandable to the whole ecosystem of actors who are using these systems, whether it is the policymakers or the lawyers or the military officials, is going to be critical so that people don't just experience this automation bias of thinking, well, the system has decided this, that's got to be the right answer, right? I think we want to resist that. So thank you for the question.
Okay. Brian, 30, 45 seconds there. I'm managing the clock here. I get my bonus if we finish on time.
It's a multidisciplinary challenge, and we succeed when we approach it from a multidisciplinary approach. If we find ourselves in a stovepipe or a silo of excellence, focused solely on data science or solely on the legal aspects or solely on the operational aspects, we're not going to get a complete answer. And so I would encourage you, whether you're coming from a data science perspective or some other perspective, think of it as a multidisciplinary problem.
The book is The Double Black Box, National Security, Artificial Intelligence, and the Struggle for Democratic Accountability by Ashley Deeks. It's available on Oxford University Press. I told Ashley that if she had a boost in sales today, I expected a commission out of it. Hey, to all of our folks online and certainly those in the room, and we have a full house here in the room, thank you. Thank you for being part of this. Thanks to the Miller Center for providing not only the environment, but the framework to be able to do these conversations. They're important for America. They're important for the future of national security. And we appreciate you investing the time and the energy to be with us today. So without further ado, please join me in thanking our guests today for a very stimulating conversation.